Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Yuracek.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Mercanzini, and he is the founder and chief technology officer at Aleva Neurotherapeutics. And I'm pretty excited because they've been a little bit under the radar and intentionally. And so they're announcing and having a big push about what they've been working on, which is basically deep brain stimulation and directional deep brain stimulation. So Andre, welcome on the podcast. And do you want to explain what Aleva does a little bit and a little bit of your background as well?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate the time today. So I'm actually originally from Toronto. I have now been living in Switzerland for about 20 years. We moved here 20 years ago with the idea of just coming for a few years, do a PhD, and go back to Canada or the US. My wife and I decided this is a wonderful place to live. Professionally, we could achieve everything that we wanted to, so we did decide to stay. And in no small part, we also stayed because of the opportunities that were ahead of the company that I created in 2008, which was Aleva Neurotherapeutics. So that story is really a startup that came out of my PhD work here at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, otherwise known as the EPFL in French. And I was working under a prolific entrepreneur in the micro and nanotechnology field named Professor Philippe Renaud, who has spun out several companies with his PhD students and postdocs from the EPFL successfully here in the Lausanne and region and in Switzerland in general. So the EPFL at the time was a very special place because there was a medical device community. There was medical device companies, both in manufacturing and in commercialization around us as students and as academics. And there was a merge between micro and nano engineering, mostly grandfathered by Professor Philippe Renaud, with medical devices, both implants and diagnostics, lab on a chip, and so on, that basically led to several technologies that did form companies and startups that were venture financed. So we were in a field that was quite ripe and that investors were looking at quite seriously at the time. In the late 2000s, neuroscience was developing quite well in the Lausanne and Geneva area here in Switzerland. There was extensive interaction between engineers and clinicians, academics, and this was mostly thanks to Henry Markram forming the Brain Mind Institute here at EPFL, but also thanks to the visionary leaders and president of EPFL at the time, Patrick Abischer, who happens to be a neurologist as well, directing resources into this field. So I think on your podcast, you've interviewed other people from our community here in Switzerland, particularly good friends of mine, Professor Nichera and Nicola Vachikouras, both of whom I know very well. We work very closely. So we've had a good run here as neurotech entrepreneurs, I would say, merging engineering and medicine, and always remaining close to the hospitals where the initial clinical data is collected.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. It does seem like there's a pocket, like a nice ecosystem over there, and definitely being a big push. So you're saying that the environment there is conducive to neurotech startups because of the funding. And what would you say that is a special thing there that maybe other places could copy or are not able to copy?
Yeah, there's three stars that align that I think are particularly to this area here in Switzerland is that it is the funding. So there are venture capital funds in Switzerland or European venture funds that are interested in Swiss investments. There are family offices that have venture capital wings to them as well that invest in startups in the community. So that's one star that has to align, is really the financial resources. And the other two are basically the technologies themselves, which are coming out of EPFL. That's the engineering push side. And the ability for the medical community to pick and choose and what is most unique or what is most interesting to them, and to actually take that to a clinical study to demonstrate whether that modality is something that will improve patient outcomes. Really aligning the access to financial resources, the access to technology and the engineers that push that technology, and the access to the clinical science, the surgeons, the neurologists that are ready to use, test, and demonstrate the utility of those technologies. Those are really three stars that have to align. And I think that we've done very well in this part of Switzerland in aligning those three stars.
Yeah, that's really cool. I love this kind of translational environment. I'm all about that. I think that's very important. So the PhD work doesn't just languish somewhere on a shelf and never get utilized. So yeah, let's talk about Aleva. What is it about? And I guess we have to briefly explain deep brain stimulation and the challenges with that too.
Sure. I'll start where the technologies that we had laid out by the time we had demonstrated that the MEMS, so MEMS means micro electromechanical systems, and that is a microengineering technology, usually with the fabrication of thin films. We, on our side of the planet, were demonstrating the implantability and the biostability of these technologies. And in parallel, there were obviously many other groups working on this in the States. Jack Judy at UCLA, Daryl Kipke's team in Michigan, and at his company EuroNexus were also pioneers in the use of MEMS for neural recording and neural stimulation. So these groups and ours in Switzerland, I would say we were working on demonstrating that these technologies could be implanted for a very long time and remain stable in animal data at the time, but translating that towards patients. And I would say nowadays on the MEMS front, we've been joined obviously by Neuralink and Elon Musk's vision of achieving their vision of a high channel count implant in the brain. It depends on MEMS. And we were these groups were working on this more than 10 years ahead of the time. So I think we were well ahead of that. And it's good to see Elon catching up, so to speak.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, it's amazing stuff. And again, these pockets of innovation. So hey guys, just a quick pause to talk about our show sponsor, Iris Biomedical. Iris Biomedical provides a portfolio of neural sensing and simulation platforms and components to accelerate early-stage medical device companies through preclinical and early feasibility studies. Iris is an ideal partner for companies with limited budgets or resources to invest in developing a new platform from the ground up. Their experienced engineering team, in-house cleanroom facilities, and ISO 13485 certified quality management system allow for prototyping and early-stage commercial production. Be sure to tell them you heard about it on the Neural Implant Podcast. That'll really help us out. Thanks. Now, back to the show. What's DBS? And then I guess, how did Aleva get started? You were saying this spun out of your PhD work. What did that look like then? And maybe how has it changed now?
Yeah, so deep brain stimulation is a surgical intervention, most often indicated to Parkinson's patients, where the patient is suffering from side effects of taking medication. And they're working with a neurologist. They could be indicated to a procedure that would potentially help them decrease the amount of levodopa that they are taking. So you've had a patient on your podcast who told his story and his patient journey. And I think he quite successfully was able to decrease a considerable amount of levodopa that he was taking. So that is really a major achievement for neurosurgeons and the neurologists that they work with to bring a patient from a level of, I would say, severe side effects that are induced by the medication that is supposed to be helping them to a strong reduction in the amount of medication thanks to an implant. And the system itself looks a lot like a pacemaker, but we call it an implantable pulse generator. And it has an extension cable that leads to two craniotomies in the skull where two electrode leads are inserted on either side of the brain, most often targeting the subthalamic nucleus, the SDN, but also some clinics or some particular patients could be indicated to the globus pallidus in certain cases. Beyond Parkinson's disease, it's indicated for essential tremor, which is another movement disorder. It's indicated to dystonia, and psychiatry indications have started or have been attempted by several companies, and that's continuing, both in major depressive disorder, but also in obsessive compulsive disorder. There have been attempts also in addiction and eating disorders using deep brain stimulation as last efforts or final efforts in treating those patients for those indications. So it really, I would say, when we were looking at this from a technology perspective, the surgical procedure is complicated and uncertain. The devices at the time were large and clunky. And so it did open itself up as an indication to miniaturization and obviously further technologies added to the implant or the patient journey in general to provide them with better outcomes. So the beginning of Aleva was that sometime in 2017, my thesis advisor, Professor Renaud, set up a coffee between myself and a neurosurgeon at the University of Lausanne Medical School to talk about MEMS technologies and nanotechnology and demonstrate to a clinician what we were making and what else we could make. And so that coffee was the first time I met my co-founder at Aleva, Dr. Claudio Polo. And we hit it off immediately. We talked over 4 hours that afternoon. That wasn't enough. We went to dinner that week. And I remember sitting at the restaurant with him. We flipped over the placemat and we started drawing on the back of the placemat different devices, different electrode designs, different implants. And I was explaining to Dr. Polo what basically the design space was. This is what we can make today with micro and nanotechnologies. And he was pulling from the design space as to what was useful for him as a surgeon treating Parkinson's patients and epilepsy patients and patients with chronic pain. So together as an engineer and as a physician, we adapted. He crossed out, he circled certain things, made changes to the drawings to the point where we were quite far into the design process that was iterative. I, as an engineer, would say this is what can be made, and he, as a surgeon, would say this is what's useful and this is what's not useful. And I think we were doing quite well in imagining how neurosurgery could be greatly improved. And we ended up forming the company together. We're still very close friends. We still see each other very often, talk at least once a week. And Dr. Polo is an integral part of Aleva's success. He was the first physician to implant our devices here in Switzerland. That really is basically the ideation process for Aleva that lasted about 6 months. I attended, I think, almost every surgery of Claudio's during that time. He brought me into surgeries for SIGs for epilepsy, cortical stimulation for pain, and most notably DBS for Parkinson's. And we realized during that time and in those discussions that the intervention that could benefit the most from the technologies that I was walking around with which was namely the MEMS technologies and miniaturization technologies. The intervention that could benefit the most was by far and away deep brain stimulation. And specifically, one of the ideas that had been hanging around for a long time in the space, but no one had figured out how to make it, was a directional DBS electrode. And so what I mean by directional DBS electrode is that instead of having an electrode lead that has rings one on top of the other, and you choose which ring to stimulate, what the clinical pull was to be able to stimulate in one of 3 or one of 4 directions around the circumference of the lead. And that sounds a trivial design problem, but it's actually very difficult to put into place and to implement as a device, as a long-term implantable device. And that is really what we went after, and what the formation of Aleva and creating the company in 2008 was about, was introducing this modality. So that led us to founding the company together with Professor Renaud and as a spinoff of the EPFL. And we created the company right in the middle of the 2008 financial crisis, which meant it was interesting times for financing. But we eventually did raise an angel round in 2010 from prominent Swiss family offices that have now been supporting us for over a decade. And in 2012, when venture capital stabilized a little bit after the financial crisis, we completed the raise of our Series A round with Swiss and French venture capital.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. Some of the best companies I've heard have come out of recessions or are founded in recessions. So it makes you have to think a little bit more scrappy. Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I didn't know that having directional leads was such a design problem. I mean, why wouldn't you just have one electrode on one side and you just activate that side or something like this? Why is it a challenge?
Yeah, it's a challenge on several levels. Number one, as the electrode gets smaller, you start to run into current density issues, which can lead to safety issues in the tissue. It obviously is a very expensive design to implement using conventional machining technologies or even laser micromachining technologies. If it's difficult to build, it becomes unreliable. Electrodes might not be connected to their wire, and it becomes quite a mess of wires and so on. So what MEMS allowed us to do is to basically align every single electrode into its position, have it almost pre-wired, and decrease the amount of touch time that an operator would have to spend on the device as they're manufacturing it, which gives us a price advantage as well. So that was from the manufacturing side. And that obviously MEMS is very helpful because it's an inexpensive manufacturing technique. There's also some subtleties on how fine you want the actual electrode to be, its corners, its edges, the smoothness of its surface, all have a lot to do with the robustness and longevity of that electrode once it's been implanted in the brain of a patient and is intended to function for 10 years. And those subtleties are not so easy to achieve with more conventional manufacturing methods. But nonetheless, at the time in 2012 and 13 and 14, directionality was quite new and nobody really knew whether it would work. Not even we knew whether it would work. So we were really on track to demonstrating this in a clinical study. A competitor popped up, which was Sapiens, that had spun out of Philips in Holland. And it was friendly competition because we were all nervous about whether this would work, but we were all really trying to demonstrate directionality in patients as quickly as possible. So we ran a clinical study that completed in 2013 in a set of patients that were implanted with a directional electrode during a routine deep brain stimulation surgery. So basically, Dr. Pohl had recruited patients that were getting a deep brain stimulation implant from Medtronic, but for about 45 minutes to an hour during the routine implantation, we were acutely placing our MEMS directional electrode and demonstrating whether directionality was actually an observable effect and whether it had any utility. And what we saw right from the beginning, from the very first patient, was a very strong directional effect. So how this manifests in the OR, in the operating room, is that if you turn on one direction, you would get a full beneficial effect with side effects only appearing at much higher currents or not at all, right? And then on any other direction could give you side effects at lower amplitudes or no beneficial effects at all. So the differentiation between the separate electrodes was quite clear and very demarcated. And that allowed us, even with the small number of patients we had, which was 13, it allowed us to demonstrate, or at least start to demonstrate, a statistical significance of this directionality effect. And we published that in Brain, in the journal Brain. And around the same time, Sapiens was also publishing their data, which was certainly very complementary to ours, demonstrating that this directionality effect did have the potential to drastically improve clinical outcomes in DBS patients.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting. And it is weird to think about that time you guys didn't know. But yeah, it makes sense. Like, before, it was just putting in this kind of telephone pole into the brain and then just zapping it and hoping for the best. And this, at least, you started to have a little bit more tunability and everything like this. Yeah. Okay. So you guys started this in 2012, something like this, 2008. And what has the evolution been in the last decade? And then maybe what's future directions?
Yeah, so from that point, really, those first studies and that first demonstration of the modality, we went on to build the entire system. So we went on to compete with the incumbent companies, Medtronic and Abbott. At the time, it was called St. Jude and Boston Scientific. So we partnered with as many companies as we could in order to develop an implantable stimulator, in order to develop the remainder of the system components. So we really just had the lead in 2014. And as we built that system through partnerships and through strategic alliances, that took many years of testing and verification and validation. So that's a long road of medical device development and neurotechnology development. And when we are publishing, let's say 2014, the first demonstration of this modality, suggesting that it could have an improvement in clinical outcomes in patients, submitting along the way for CE mark here in Europe, which was granted in 2010. So you can see how long and arduous that road is, and capital intensive. Neurotechnology is an expensive sport. So we raised 70 million since inception, $70 million since inception. And that has, as you can see, largely been dedicated to the regulatory pathway, both here in Europe and in the US. So after achieving the CE mark in Europe, we submitted to the FDA IDE process, which earlier this year we were granted the IDE. And the FDA process was, I would say, certainly a step up from what we had to submit from CE mark, but certainly depended heavily on what we had gathered for the CE mark in Europe. In 2021, we started our very first series of patients in Germany, and the first cohort of those patients are passing their 6-month data points, which we will be publishing very soon. So it's not a blinded study. We've been watching the data come in, and I can say that the indicators are all green. We're showing not only further evidence of the directionality effects, those are quite obvious, but of course, we're working towards endpoints on the improvement of UPDRS, which is the rating scale used for Parkinson's disease patients, and a decrease in the amount of medication, of levodopa, that the patients are taking. So that will be news that will be coming out soon in literature and conferences, mostly led by the surgeons and neurologists leading that research. On the topic of what we see coming down the pipeline for new technologies. So from our point of view at Aleva, we do work towards further miniaturization of the system. Very obviously smaller and more numerous electrode contacts, obviously continuing to work on the MEMS technology that can very easily reach into the smaller size scales that physicians are requesting. We're investing into smaller pulse generator implants, and all signs are pointing towards these implants eventually being mounted on the skull. So a cranial implant in the future is certainly in the future for DBS. There has been a lot of work on sensing, namely by Medtronic and their Percept system, but also by our friends here in Europe at Neuronica. That data is still coming in. The jury will determine how that improves clinical outcomes for patients, but that's certainly a space to watch as it could be an important modality. And then outside of the brain, but still working towards delivering better outcomes for patients, you have sensing and physiology from wearables. So taking measurements outside of the body and closing the loop outside of the body, either through using the patient's phone or sensors on their legs and arms, wrists and shoes. I think this is all quite interesting. Some of these technologies are certainly much less expensive than developing new implants, and they could go quite a ways to improving clinical outcomes for these patients in need.
Yeah, it's all really exciting stuff and kind of making the system smart. Let's talk about the 70 million you raised. And that seems like a lot. I don't know. I've heard, of course, CE mark and FDA ID and everything like this. It's an expensive process, but why 70? I've always heard it was like on the order of 5 or 10 or something like this. So this is obviously much higher. Was it just because it's in the brain, DBS or something like this? Is it a DBS specific thing? Or what's the reason behind that?
Yeah, I think it is a neurotechnology specific amount. When you're working towards active implantables, you are up against all of the norms and requirements, both for the CE mark and the FDA. So there's a large battery of tests. Since you're looking for labeling, goes for over 10 years. You have to demonstrate through your testing that your device obviously is robust enough and will remain safe and reliable for an extended period of time. And there's no way to go in and fix anything. It's like sending a satellite into space. Once it's up there, it's got to work. So the risk profile of the implant itself is of such a high degree that mitigating that risk certainly takes extensive testing on and multifaceted understanding of what the safety and what the risks are to the patient should something not function. The other element certainly is that when it's not a straight line developing from zero, from basically a PhD student's bench to a commercial product. And so there are bumps along the road, and some of those bumps require additional financing or additional time, which translates into needing more money. That requires something that I've been very lucky to have, which is patient and understanding shareholders and investors that understood the vision, understood the importance of the vision of this company, and helped the company through the bumps in the road in order to continue towards achieving its vision. So, if everything is a straight line and everything is perfect, I could concur with your 10 million, maybe, but it certainly it's not like that. I think when we looked at where most of the financial resources have been applied over the years, I could say that the first 10 million did go towards the acute demonstration of the modality itself. So at the time where we didn't know whether this was going to work or how well it would work, I think that's the first in man demonstration and getting to a statistical level and designing that so that it is submittable for a CE mark. I think that is for a neurotechnology company, that's a reasonable amount of 10 to 15 million to get to that first demonstration. Thereafter, when you have to build a system, partner with collaborators and collaborating companies and strategic companies to build an entire system, certainly the costs become extensive, and building a regulatory team and building an engineering team, the costs become quite expensive. So this is, as I said, it's not only a marathon, it's also an expensive marathon. So it's a long road and it's very capital intensive along the way.
Yeah, that's it's crazy amounts of money that most of us have never even seen or come close to seeing. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So another thing too is I've heard that physicians a lot of times, or the surgeons, they're used to, they know what they know, and then they're used to these specific treatments or something like this. So a lot of times, if it's good enough, they tend to stick with that a little bit more. But you said that the surgeons and the neurologists they're requesting these smaller leads and more precise things. Is that the case? And are you sure that it would translate into them actually using it and knowing how to use it and everything like this? Is there a big demand for it, I guess?
Yeah, on your first point, there is an adoption curve where you have early adopters and you have more mainstream, and then you have the laggards. I guess it's all Clayton Christensen type theories of adoptions of new technologies. So you definitely have that in medicine, and certainly with surgeons and neurologists. There are people, there are groups, or there are clinics that don't want to see anything that's new because everything is good enough and it doesn't rock their boat too much. And then you have, as anywhere, early adopters that are intrigued, that have their own ideas or have been waiting for something like you've developed that will very quickly help you and very quickly adopt in order to test to see how well it functions against what they're used to. And that signal, so that's great about early adopters, but you do have to provide them with a signal that you're using their time respectfully and wisely so that they continue to use your product and they continue to adopt it. So I think that there's obviously many books on this and how to approach this, but those of us in the neurotechnology field, our customers are the purchasing customer really is the surgeon and the neurologist as a duo, but the end customer is the patient. At the end of the day, you have to have a clinical outcome improvement in that patient, or else there's no reason to adopt a new technology. And so as curious or intrigued or excited as an early adopting surgeon or an early adopting neurologist could be, if you don't deliver a significant improvement in clinical outcomes for their patients, then they're going to move on to the next thing.
Yeah, that's a good point, is that the adoption curve, I guess, applies to all humans, and the surgeons are humans as well. So there are the early adopters, there are the laggards. So that's pretty interesting. Before we started recording, you had mentioned something about future directions of the company and wearables. Do you want to expand on this, or do you want to, I guess, introduce this idea a little bit?
Sure. I think that as we continue on our path to miniaturize the device further, and are looking at additional sizes and architectures of the electrodes that are actually doing the heavy work in the brain and stimulating for a decade, you start to look at other, I would say, inputs into the patient journey and improving the clinical outcome. And one thing that has certainly evolved over the past 15 years is the fact that we all have what could become the greatest medical device in history sitting in our pocket at all times. It's our cell phones, and they are collecting data already, or we can get them to collect additional data. And so following the patient and empowering the patient to address their therapy, I think, is certainly something that we will be seeing more of in Parkinson's disease and epilepsy and other indications. And this has a lot to do with how that data is collected from their body or from their behavior, and how it is then used to program or inform the stimulation that is occurring in the deep brain. So that's certainly an area that we're very excited about. And then the second area that we are very excited about is that the programming of the patient really right now is the bottleneck, so that everybody understands after a deep brain stimulation surgery, the patient recovers from the surgery and they'll come back to the hospital perhaps a week or 2 weeks later. Some hospitals take a little bit longer, and we start to turn on the device, or the neurologist would turn on the device and start to determine which electrode is actually pointing in the best direction and which one is not. And so that's a selection which can happen quite quickly, because the best electrode is quite obvious and the worst electrodes are quite obvious. So that process can happen quite quickly, but nonetheless, it is complicated and time consuming, and it requires the operator, whether it's a neurologist or a nurse, or in some cases a surgeon themselves, and in some geographies we're seeing the companies highly involved in the programming step. That can be a confusing process for the patient and for the person doing the programming. So going back to the surgical imaging, both in the MRI and the CT scan, can help point towards and inform the programming experience to make it faster or make it more certain and make it less tiring for the patient and for the physician that is attempting to program them. And so we see a lot of opportunity there. There's some technological modalities we have built into our device that allow us to image in a certain manner, that allow us to orient the electrode in that image and make pretty good first guesses of which is the best electrode to turn on and at what amplitude. Our competitors are, namely Boston Scientific, are also working on that, and Medtronic are also working on that. But we think that as a smaller, nimble DBS startup, we can move into those modalities much faster than these larger companies can.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something that I've heard is a impediment as well to having more electrodes, is basically, you have to come in and they have to dial it in. And dialing in 8 electrodes, dialing in 8 knobs is possible. But if you have 800, then that gets to be very problematic and difficult, and honestly, a task more for computers rather than humans. And so it's nice to have that sensing and wearable thing that you were talking about too. So Andre, this is very impressive and inspiring. What advice do you have for people who want to follow in your footsteps and want to raise $70 million? And do you have to be in Switzerland to do this, or what would you recommend?
You can certainly be anywhere in the world and advancing medicine, advancing patient care. If you have a passion for this, if this is what you want to do with your life, and when you leave this planet, that you had an impact on people that were suffering, that you improved their suffering, that you develop new medical therapies and new medicines, it's a long road, but it is obviously a very fulfilling road from the point of view of what you can accomplish in your career. So my advice to PhD students, postdocs, physician inventors, and professors working on neurotechnologies is that you have to work on something that will make a major change in patient outcomes. It cannot just be incremental. If it has any signs of only being incremental, it will be very difficult to get funded. It will be very difficult to get your early adopters to sign up and use or test your device. And that is always, it's always a difficult metric to determine what that means. Is it a 20% improvement in symptoms? Is it a 40% improvement in symptoms? Is it treating a disease that is not treatable today? That is really the major choice you have to make as an entrepreneur in neurotechnology, is whether your work will have a significant change in patient outcomes. And introducing an entirely new modality or a new surgical approach or a new type of therapy usually is a very good start to answering that question as to whether you're going to have the effect that you're searching to have on patients. So that's really the first one. And the second one, piece of advice, is that, as I explained in my story with Dr. Claudio Polo, it's really the importance of the team, whether it's the founding team or the team that comes around the founders afterwards to continue to develop the technology further, and the professionals and investors that come around. Every, I would say, early team, every founder has to be very different from each other. And I was very fortunate in the case that I was an engineer pushing design, and Claudio was a physician pulling in what was useful and discarding the rest. That was an iterative process that proved to be very successful for the company we founded, and ultimately for the patients that we're aiming to serve. Really, the cognitive diversity you have in that founding team, I think, is a strong indicator of how successful you'll be. And then when you grow that team, again, hiring people that think as differently as possible from the founding team will be the next step in maintaining the cognitive diversity in that small neurotechnology company, to make sure that it's successful through the maze of regulatory requirements and obviously through the maze of the clinical requirements.
Yeah, for sure. I think finding people that think differently than you, it can be refreshing. Some people don't like it, but I think it's very refreshing sometimes, getting new perspective on things. And then also, you've raised a lot of money, and so is that good, or is that, obviously it's necessary, but if you can avoid it to the extent that you can, your ownership ends up getting diluted. And I've heard in Silicon Valley startups and stuff like this that a lot of times the founder might get just diluted so all the way down that they almost have less stock than, I don't know, just some random advisor or something like this. Is that a problem, or what's some advice with fundraising?
My advice there is that the only problem with dilution is if you're obsessed with a number that is beside your name on that capitalization table. If you're looking at that number and you're determining your self-esteem by that number, you're not going to be able to get out of bed in the morning and go change medicine. As the company progresses, as other team members come around the founder, and as you have more capital requirements, dilution is a matter of fact. And if you're seeing that number could be 100% or 50% on the day you found the company, and that's the last time it'll be that high. It can only go down. And I think that if you think about that too much, you as the founder and the driving force behind what is supposed to be the initial energy of the company, you might not make it energy wise, because it's not the metric that you have. The metric you have is that your inventions, your technologies, your work reach patients, and that in those patients, there's a clinical outcome or a clinical improvement, and that they live a better life. That's your first number to look at. And that number takes a very long time to come back. It could take 10 years, it could take 15 years. In pharmaceutical development, it could take 20 years. But that is your, I would say, North Star metric. And it's not the percentage of the company that you own or the percentage of a company that somebody else owns, because it's simply, you cannot derive enough energy and you cannot derive enough enthusiasm from that capitalization table. You can only derive the energy you need to do this work from the effect that you're having on your fellow humans on this planet before you leave it.
Yeah, definitely. So think about the mission and how the money is accelerating it, and versus selfish things or something like this. Yeah, very cool. Well, Andre, I think this has been a very interesting talk. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
So the last thing I would say is that if you are working on a neurotechnology and you are thinking about a spin-off or a startup, or you've already done so and you're hitting the inevitable bumps in the road, please feel free to contact me. I'm on LinkedIn. I routinely answer questions and emails about the arduous process of developing a neurotechnology. And I hope that this has telling the story of what we've accomplished, telling the story of what it means fulfillment-wise to develop a new neurotechnology and bring it to commercial use in Europe and soon in the United States, serves as a guide for those of you out there that listen to this podcast and think about the work that you're doing and how it will affect medicine, how it will affect your fellow humans.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible stuff, and I think having somebody like you in their corner would be really good for startups. So I think that's a nice support that you're offering. So yeah, thank you for that. Well, Andre, this has been excellent. Thank you so much for this, and I wish you lots of success with this, and I hope it's going to change a lot of lives.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.